So after much mental assessment and therapy, I have been told that it might be beneficial for me to possibly zero in on and focus my attention to some of the best diesels that British Rail made. Now, I understand that this could blow up in my face in many ways, but remember, British Rail didn't always do bad things. Yeah, they had a pretty rough modernization plan, which is about the most understated way I could possibly explain that, but it wasn't like they always did terrible things. They wouldn't have been able to function as a railroad if all their locomotives were garbage, and they did have plenty of successes, some that were legitimately outstanding in their own right. So let's talk about 5 of the best diesels that British Rail had. The British Rail Class 20, sometimes called the English Electric Type 1. These were diesel-electric locomotives that were originally constructed between 1957 and 1962, indeed, for the British Rail Modernization Plan. Now, naturally, that's a bit of a red flag, but the Class 20s wound up standing out as they functioned. English Electric in general was actually one of the few manufacturers in the UK that almost always delivered solid products when it came to diesels, and the Class 20s were no exception. They had intentionally designed them around very basic technology. These locomotives only produced 1,000 horsepower, but they could operate at 75 miles per hour, 121 kilometers per hour. They were meant for light mixed freight traffic. Their appearance is not totally dissimilar from American switcher units, with the cabs only at one end. And while this did create visibility issues, as far as the crews were concerned, it wasn't that different from, well, steam locomotives that were set up in a very similar way. And British Rail got around this by simply coupling 2 of the Class 20s together nose to nose, so that there'd be a cab at each end. This would also have the benefit of doubling up their power, and a significant portion of the photos of them in operation do have them in this particular setup. When the modernization plan got into the really rough years, and many other types of the diesels that British Rail had failed, the Class 20s kept working consistently, so well, in fact, that British Rail ordered even more of them to replace other types that, well, didn't work. The Class 20s, simply put, functioned. They were, by design, just your average diesel, but that's exactly what British Rail needed back then. They needed something that functioned, and that's what the Class 20s did. In the end, English Electric would wind up building 228 of the things, and incredibly, they survive until even now. Yes, 6 are still considered in service, and 22 have been preserved. Their inoffensive and basic design means that they can be utilized for a lot of different applications, easily giving them a spot on this list. The British Rail Class 08. Yeah, you guys might have seen this one coming, as this might be one of the most famous diesels under British Rail. For one thing, they were featured heavily in Thomas the Tank Engine, as several characters actually utilized them as a basis, including the original villain of the series, Diesel. Devious Diesel, to be precise. But despite often being associated with bad guys in fiction, the 08s in real life were very good. So good that not only did they spawn several derivative classes based on their design, but British Rail produced an insane amount of the 08s, 996 of these little devils. British Railways constructed these in-house between 1952 and 1962, and several different works manufacturers were responsible for them, including Crewe and Derby. Though it's probably worth mentioning that their traction motors and prime mover were English Electric designs. These guys had one primary job, and that was shunting. As a result, they could never ever go very fast, capping out between 15 and 20 miles per hour, depending on their gearing, and their power output was only 350 horsepower, but that was okay, because again, they were shunters. They were meant to work in the yards and move cars around, and that was it. And they were really good at that since, while they were slow, a driver could get in one, turn it on, and expect it to move. There are over 70 of this type in preservation, as heritage railways in particular adore tiny diesels. Not only are they somewhat cute, but they're very useful just to have around. And while a significant portion of them, of course, were also scrapped, as of 2020, around 100 of these locomotives remain working on industrial sidings, as well as on the main network. The British Rail Class 47, sometimes called the Brush Type 4, these were diesel-electric locomotives that were developed in the 1960s by, well, brush traction. These things were fitted with Sulzer 12 LDA 28C twin bank 12-cylinder units, producing 2,750 horsepower. So they were pretty powerful by British diesel standards, and they wound up building 512 of them. They were considered excellent, even though their power units had to be derated to 2,580 horsepower to reduce stress. That was causing some reliability issues, but once that was done, everything was fine, and that was still pretty strong either way. The 47s had an insane amount of derivatives, able to do a wide variety of different jobs, with only minimal modifications, which would explain why they were so prevalent. To date, there are some that are still in service, 51 to be precise, as well as 33 that were converted to Class 57s, and 32 have already been held for preservation. The British Rail Class 55, sometimes called the English Electric Type 5, or simply a Deltic. I'd probably have some serious explaining to do if I didn't put the Deltics on this list, even though only 22 were ever made, because, well, they are considered a highlight of British diesel technology. Built between 1961 and 1962, they were based on the DP1, the initial prototype, and each one of the Class 55s contained two prime movers known as Napier Deltics, hence why the diesels are, well, called Deltic. This is a uniquely designed opposed piston valveless supercharged Uniflow Scavens 2-stroke diesel engine that, while certainly unusual, was also very powerful, and with two of them, the Deltics were able to deliver 3,300 horsepower. And the Class 55's influence was felt almost immediately. When they were introduced, the timetable was accelerated purely because of their presence. As a result, over the years, they've gathered a tremendous following among British rail fans, and they're highly respected as one of the top designs from English Electric, though they didn't last as long as some of the other models on this list. The reason is that they were very non-standard, and always were from the get-go. They were the only ones using that type of engine, and they required specialty maintenance, meaning that their running cost was higher than the average diesel. As a result, they were withdrawn between 1980 and 1982, and even during the 70s, they were put on secondary duties. Not because their performance was bad, it was great. They were just more expensive to run because of the engine. But fortunately, 6 have been preserved, 2 of which are operational, and 1, Royal Scots Grey, is mainline certified, so the Deltics will likely continue to impress for many years in the future. The British Rail Class 43. No, not that one, this one! Can we talk about how one of the worst and the best diesel that ran for British Rail happened to share the Class 43 designation? Like, that's a pretty obnoxious coincidence, not gonna lie. But the designation refers to the power cars for the Intercity 125. These were diesel-electric built by British Rail Engineering Limited between 1975 and 1982. They made 197 of these, and these were meant to be the apex of British diesel manufacturing. And while I have many videos on this channel that might indicate that that could be a bit of an oxymoron, the Class 43s really lived up to that goal. In fact, they are still to this day the fastest diesel-electric locomotive in the world, reaching a very impressive 148.5 miles per hour, 239 kilometers per hour. Though in regular service, they didn't exceed 125 miles per hour, 201 kilometers per hour, but that was still blindingly fast. The 43s were basically British Rail's attempt to actually have a high-speed train, when the APT kept suffering setbacks, not all of which were even its fault. But the 43s distinguished themselves pretty much immediately, having fast and reliable service. That continues to this day? Wait, seriously? And yes, somewhat. Even the privatized network have been struggling to adequately replace these things, and have tried many times. And based on sources, they still haven't quite managed to pull it off. They still retain a handful just in case, and some still operate every now and again, though it is getting increasingly rare. Though in early August of this year, in fact, 2023, 3 of them, plus 11 Mark III coaches, were actually exported to Mexico for use on the Ferrocarril Transísmico. So even if it's not in the UK, it seems like these locomotives are still getting use, because they were, in fact, just that good. And so far, 13 of them have been saved for preservation. So at least in that form, they're likely to remain around as the absolute highlight of British diesel technology. It just took them a few years to get there. But they did it! They did it, you guys! You gotta give them that! And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Row of Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Lord R444, Mark Holding, Murder Drones Doll, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hustle 2860, Isofer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Perez Drenton, Bradley Bowden, Dr. Racer 78, and Josh Johnson. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bit of fun. Farewell.